Chapter 16. The new year brought with it an unexpected visit from Teo's uncle and their first chance for Vanessa to meet someone from Teo's family. They were all to have afternoon tea at the Randolph Hotel, which was where Vanessa now waited for Teo and his uncle. She sat in the lounge next to an open fire, feeling uncomfortably warm, but this, she guessed, was where Teo would prefer to sit. While she waited, she watched people around her serving themselves tea from fat china teapots and sampling scones and cakes. This was Oxford's finest hotel, but Vanessa did not care for the musty, stuffy feel that came from the large upholstered armchairs and the carpet in somber shades of green and mustard. The walls were wood-paneled and several large chandeliers hung low from the ceiling. She wondered what Teo's uncle would think of the Randolph and, more importantly, what he would think of her. This wasn't just any old family friend, but Teo's favorite uncle, and, while she looked forward to meeting him, she worried too. Teo had once told her, though she suspected he had now forgotten, that in his culture one never introduced a girlfriend to family unless the relationship was serious. So this was a good sign for her. But what if she disappointed his uncle? What would Teo think of her then? Everything had been going so well since the new year, and she desperately wanted it to stay that way, especially now that Teo only had a few more months left at Oxford. Secretly she hoped he might propose before leaving. Nervously, she ran through her list of greetings. Ekasn Salafian is she practiced, hoping that the pronunciation was correct. When Teo arrived with his uncle, Ekasn Salafian, she said, curtsying as she had seen other Nigerian women do. Vanessa, my dear, lovely to meet you, the uncle said, in such a reassuring way that it made her feel immediately at ease. Teo's uncle was taller and younger than Vanessa expected, and more effusive too. Splendid! He exclaimed when the waitress brought them their Darjeeling tea, scones, sandwiches and cake. Uncle Kyote had insisted on ordering everything. Now Vanessa, do tell me, what does one begin with? Scones? Sandwiches? Or cake? I've never known. And does one put cream on these things first? As he indicated a scone, or jam. Whatever catches your fancy, I think. She smiled. Ah, but everything catches my fancy, and that, my dear, is the problem, he said, laughing as he peered eagerly at the top tray. Now, here we have a most exquisite collection of gâteaux, a little almond marzipan, shortbread, some macaroons, petit fours, and what do you suppose this is? He pointed to a rectangular slice. Elf think it ought to be something German to render the platter a true representation of Europe. A Bavarian torte, or some such thing, wouldn't you say? But just look at these other two trays, so quintessentially English. 16. D. And crustless sandwiches like the ones we were served at school cricket games, Teo added. Indeed. Uncle Kyote winked conspiratorially at Teo, for what is good for the English must also be good for their protégés abroad, and especially at those elite institutions like Fiditi Boys. Vanessa dear, did this chap ever tell you about the first-class schools he attended? Teo tried to interrupt, but had no luck as his uncle kept boasting about his nephew's school and then proceeded to describe, in some detail, his nephew's sporting prowess. I wasn't captain of every team, Teo laughed. Well, nobody's talking about silly sports like table tennis or hockey, uncle conceded. before saying something more to Teo in Yoruba while waving his hands in the air as though chasing those sports away. But look, let us partake of this wonderful spread. He opened a scone and spread it generously with a layer of clotted cream. I don't think that anything beats warm English scones. With a dab of butter, a dollop of cream, and strawberry jam. So I say, what's the good of touring dusty old barracks when some other occupation would allow me to travel, and visit my nephew and his charming young lady over this most civilized afternoon tea? Enough of army life. Are you really thinking of leaving the army, uncle? Teo asked. Indeed I am, his uncle nodded. Engineering is what I'm considering, and I would do it at the Institut Français du Pétrole in France. What do you think, Vanessa? Why engineering? She asked, surprised that he would ask. Now that's what I like, a woman who asks questions, he said, leaning forward in his chair to explain. The future of Nigeria is no longer in its army, as some of us used to think, but in the oil business. Of course there are many places here in Britain where I could study, but who can turn down an offer from France, space de liberté, égalité et fraternité. Vas parles français? Vanessa replied. Mais I one think that's enough of the French, Teo interrupted. You're right, Uncle Keod smiled. In any case, that was really the limit of my French, I'm afraid. But Teo, didn't your mother teach you French? Does my mother speak French? Teo looked surprised. Why, of course. How do you think she conducts her business? Let me tell you, Vanessa, Teo's mother is the most successful trader along the West African coast. Teo hasn't told you this, has he? She regularly visits Benin, Dahomey, and Ivory Coast, and is chief of all the textile traders in Ibadan, which is a very revered position in our Yoruba culture. But uncle, Teo protested. Vanessa smiled at Teo, who was looking shocked, but he had stopped protesting because it was obvious his uncle was enjoying telling the stories and Vanessa was enjoying listening. But do tell me something about you now, my dear. Teo tells me that you write beautifully, so tell me about your writings and some of the artists and writers you admire. She began to talk, not knowing how much of her work would really enter Teo's uncle, but he listened closely, letting his cup of tea go cold while she spoke. It was only when Teo reminded them that his uncle had a train to catch that they noticed how much time had passed. How unfortunate, Uncle Keod grumbled. With Vanessa's talk of ends issues, I was going to impress you both by telling you more about my recent encounter with Anais Nin. Anais Nin? Uncle Keod nodded, smiling at Vanessa's surprise. Then we can't possibly end the conversation, Vanessa insisted. So come with us to the station and I'll tell you about the lovely Anais. The lovely Anais, Vanessa smiled to herself, wondering how much Teo knew about Anais and what he thought of his uncle, who was apparently not at all embarrassed by this writer of erotica. She knew little about Anais Nin herself, but enough to find it surprising that an African man, whose training had not been in the arts, would not be critical. With an uncle like this, Vanessa felt certain that she would love the rest of Teo's family.